The egomaniacal villain trope is arguably the most popular and celebrated one in animated cinema. All villains have at least some components of this trope within their defining traits. But imagine a villain that's so hodgepodge, a mixture of so many different tropes, that they're almost unbearable to watch. Disney marketed the villain of Wish as their most evil creation to date. They certainly did develop a character that was a concoction of every evil thing that one can think of. Whether or not the recipe was effective, however, remains to be entirely up to debate. And most people would answer in the negative. The person in question here is King Magnifico, a white-collared sorcerer who is leading his people into the guaranteed fulfillment of their wishes. The guy spent decades learning and honing the craft of his magic in order to be able to do so. That doesn't sound quite right, does it? I didn't think so either. See, King Magnifico may have developed the ability to grant people's wishes, but whether or not he used that power for good was entirely up to him. Even his wife wasn't allowed to question his decisions. It paints a bit of a dark cloud on his otherwise beaming persona. And after that, they kept adding things to his character that just didn't fit well. The result? Well, it made Wish a movie that wasn't received very well by the critics and audience. To understand what went wrong in shaping him, we're going all the way back to the Kingdom of Rosas, where Magnifico's evil looms large. The Kingdom of Rosas has stunning similarities to the classic Sleeping Beauty film. It's a place that features an ivory tower, where the Sorcerer King lives with his wife, a city beyond the Tower Palace, and a picturesque grove just beyond. The grove is full of quaint cottages. The one in which the protagonist, Asha, lives was so familiar that I was surprised that Flora, Fauna, and Meriwether didn't come bursting into the scene. The setting, however, is ancient, so I'm assuming that these fairies weren't around at the time. In the musical number at the start of the film, we learn that King Magnifico has built his empire on his ability to grant people's wishes. There is, however, a catch. From the time that he receives the wish to the moment that it is granted, the person making the wish won't remember that they have it. Signs that all is not as rosy as it seems are also placed early on. The grand show about Magnifico's magical powers is marvelous and impressive though, to say the least. The whole thing seems celebratory and happy-go-lucky. Women swoon in sycophantic adoration of this old man. People cheer and dance, and shortly thereafter, we meet the king himself. But not before some further shade is thrown on his character. See, the problem with Magnifico's entire wish-granting regime is that only one wish is granted a month. We don't know the total population of this kingdom, but for a magician, by all standards, that's a pretty low rate. It's not just that either. Eerily, when you turn 18, you don't have a choice but to give your wish away. And once you've given up your wish, it seems that you change. The manner in which people change after their wish is granted doesn't immediately become apparent. In fact, Asha's friend Simon, who has given up his wish, just seems like a sleepy old fellow. Granted, Asha's friends are all basically personifications of the dwarves from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Also, granted that Gabo, who's throwing shade at King Magnifico here, is a lot like Grumpy. But the idea of giving up your wish seems a little shady in general. None of us missed that part, and at this point, barely 10 minutes into the film, we already have a lot of questions. Why do so many wishes not get answered? Why are people compelled to give their wishes? It just doesn't seem right. We think it's okay though. King Magnifico is going to turn out to be evil, and the script is setting the stage for his eventual grand reveal. We already know he's an egotistical person, a bit of a narcissist from all the statues and paintings of him in the city. It's just that the curtains dropped too soon. Immediately thereafter, Asha went to visit King Magnifico in his chamber to interview for a position to be his assistant, and he revealed his true colors immediately. So he's not exactly a twist villain. He doesn't neatly fit the trope anyway. He's definitely a narcissist, and he has bad intentions with people's wishes. King Magnifico seems to be reluctant to let go of people's wishes and not grant them, because keeping them on his person gives him joy and possibly also longevity. That would explain why he's so chipper and energetic despite his old age. It's just that this grand reveal was made too early on in the film. King Magnifico explains to Asha that he can't grant everyone's wishes and needs to keep them locked up because some of them could potentially be dangerous for them. To this, Asha asks why he couldn't just give them back if he didn't want to grant them, and he becomes angry. And that is the exact moment that his whole good guy facade is dropped.
I decide what everyone deserves.
Magnifico's justification to the whole thing is that some wishes are far too dangerous to be given back to the people that they belong to, which could be fair. But his justification is entirely incorrect, and we see him for the evil that he carries because the starting sequence of this movie clearly stated the opposite. And judging by the state of poor old Simon, or Sleepy if he was a dwarf in Snow White, locking people's wishes up in a secret chamber doesn't do them any good. The reason King Magnifico wanted to keep the wishes was not because he was some beacon of protection, but rather because the wishes gave him power. While everyone praised and adored him, he was really rotten on the inside. It's established. King Magnifico is the bad guy. We aren't even 15 minutes into the film, and given the fact that the starting sequence painted him as a hero, it could have waited a little longer for that to be revealed. The hero image could have continued by showing these bad wishes the kingdom needs protection from. After that, an extra twist could be added, like they did with Turbo. His twist just came too soon. So what is King Magnifico's story? I'm not making up the part about the half-baked twist villain trope being a bit of bad writing. To explain, let's take a look at his origin story. Magnifico wasn't always a sorcerer. At one point, he was just your average Joe. He understood the power of having dreams and hope. He also understood, however, how much heartbreak comes with your wish not being fulfilled. In the start of the movie, we're told that Magnifico learned magic in order to be able to grant wishes. His original intention was to protect wishes from the harm that they can suffer on their road to fulfillment, and he decided to proliferate this knowledge to everyone he knew. Together with his wife, he built the kingdom of Rosas. People migrated here far and wide in the hopes to meet the mighty sorcerer and have their wish granted. The story of how he instituted a monthly wish-taking and wish-granting ceremony is not elaborated on, so we don't know for sure whether or not he was always evil. It is safe to conclude, however, that understanding the power and joy that these wishes brought made him cling to them. And then he instituted an authoritarian regime. By outlawing magic to all other people, King Magnifico created an impenetrable status quo. So was he a tyrannical villain? Was his main goal to build and keep power? The motives of King Magnifico aren't exactly clear here, and that's what happens when you try to make one bad guy be every bad guy in the book. He seems a little confused. I did, however, observe him very closely. While watching the movie, I made sure that I was taking everything that Magnifico did into account, and I have some ideas about what his motivations really are. It's also worth noting that King Magnifico, in and of himself, is an origin story. I'll explain whose origin story he is later, though. For now, let's go back to his motives and why they weren't clearly reflected. King Magnifico clearly enjoys the status that he has set for himself. He likes to command people. He covets the monopoly that he has over magical powers, and he's obviously having a lot of fun bubble bathing in the wishes. But then there's a book. We learn later on in the movie that it's a book full of forbidden magic and needs to be stayed away from. Earlier on, Asha comes across it when she first enters Magnifico's chambers. She accidentally sets off the dragonflies that Magnifico has enchanted to protect it. Side note, who in God's name bewitches dragonflies to protect an ancient relic of evil magic? What is wrong with this guy? And Magnifico doesn't exactly seem perturbed. He charms his way into his entrance scene and self-adulates as he tells Asha that the book isn't supposed to be touched. Given how calm he is, does he not know that the book is evil? If he doesn't, then why is he protecting it? And if he does, then why is he resisting it? Later on in the film, Magnifico disappears off with the book to a secret basement where he practices witchcraft to create a staff that will make him more powerful than a star. I mean, the guy already thinks that he's a star, but, still. So then what exactly is going on when we first see him? I'll tell you, it's bad writing. There is no clear motive.
All I really want is just a little respect.
Well, Magnifico, we all want respect. that's not a motive. Magnifico likes to be the center of attention and desires praise, recognition, and power, but you can't write an egotistical villain simply by giving him a motley combination of various other tropes. The core motive and the origin story need to be solid. King Magnifico is the result of several tropes that, when combined, didn't blend well together. The character's personality clashes with itself the same way that oil separates from water in a glass. It's evident from the entrance scene where his personality switches and glitches. Later on, he transforms into a pure force of unadulterated evil. But even then, his personality's still not quite right. Let's look at the entrance scene first, though, shall we? King Magnifico breezes into the entrance scene. He's actually being pretty nice to Asha during her interview. He even praises her father. There is, however, an underlying tint of meanness. It's barely perceptible though, and it's going well with the original trope that we thought he was, so let's leave that there. What I didn't understand was why his egotism wasn't clearly depicted in the first scene. It wasn't as though he wasn't full of himself. He was, but his central motive, as depicted in the first scene, seemed to be to remain in power by harnessing the joy of the wish bubbles. In the first scene, King Magnifico seemed to be a twist villain who was revealed too soon for him to properly fit into the archetype. He also had a lot of superficial villain elements, and his underlying motive was to remain in power by continuing to take that which was not his. And what point did he go batshit crazy with glowing green eyes and that whole intimidating persona? And more importantly, why? It seems as though later on, the writers decided to switch him up into a supernatural villain who was a force of pure evil. So evil was he, in fact, that it seemed as though he would stop at nothing in order to get what he wanted: total dominion over all of Rosas. In all honesty, that seemed like a pretty small aim right from the very get-go. When Magnifico learned the secret magic of the evil book, he became powerful enough to take down a star. I mean, he did have to crush several people's wishes, throwing them into the depths of grief by crushing the hopes and dreams of their hearts, but he did gain all that power. This again was bad writing. Magnifico was already an incredibly powerful villain. His dominion was challenged only by the burst of magical golden light that came from a cute and bubbly star. For him to undergo a second switch from a poorly written twist villain to utterly, incredibly, unbelievably powerful supernatural villain was a bit much. And the second part seemed to be an afterthought. It appeared as though the writers wanted to figure out how to make Magnifico scary after they'd already revealed who he truly was as a person and couldn't think of any other ways to do so. As I've already explained, there were no deep ties to that book before the entrance of Star in the movie. When Magnifico became a batshit crazy, super evil, supernatural villain for the second time in the film, he committed heinous crimes. Before, he had seized people's wishes. Now, he was crushing them. It just took him a step above his original evil. It didn't bring complexity into the equation, and it wasn't driven from his egotism. Rather, this second switch was driven from a place of fear. Magnifico was afraid of the disruption in the status quo and wanted to find a way to fix it. While egotistical people are also quite fearful on the inside, with Magnifico's character, there were no rock-solid links to establish how his conversion from evil to evil on another level were driven from a place of ego. It just wasn't convincing enough. A lot of people even believe that he wasn't even evil. This is because he seemed to simply be guarding people's wishes to quell a rebellion. That would make him a tyrant at worst, not a villain. But does that make him worthy of redemption? Did we see any qualities that could absolve him of crushing people's wishes? Let's find out. Magnifico was a pretty bad guy. That became obvious the second we found out about the real reason why he didn't grant people's wishes, to keep them for himself. But the thing that made him irredeemable was the second switch. When Magnifico ascended from generic bad guy into bad guy with a staff, he became ruthless. He just started crushing people's wishes left and right and center. It seemed at that point that his only motivation was to acquire Star and quell the possibility of a rebellion. I'm going to backtrack a little here because when you create this kind of a hodgepodge character, even dissecting them becomes messy. King Magnifico seemed to want to protect the kingdom from wishes that had destructive power. He also seemed to want to protect people from the pain of wishes unfulfilled. However, that wasn't what he was really up to. Beneath that good guy exterior, awful intentions lurked. If we look at his original motive, that was to seize people's wishes so that he could revel in their joy. Then he wanted to capture a star so that he would become the most powerful being in Rosas. The guy was already a king, and a supernatural one at that. But on top of it all, he now also wanted to become the most ultra super powerful person around. I mean, come on, make it simpler. And no, he didn't seem to be redeemable. As soon as he converted, Magnifico could not step back from his purpose. At this point, his wife made a statement that was supposed to shed light on whether or not he could be redeemed. I mean, sure, the book did make him evil, but he was always a bad guy. And given the faith of his wife, it became difficult to ascertain whether or not he would have been just as wicked had he not read the book. But he was a villain even before then, remember? So then, the bad guy became the worst guy, but he was always sinister on the inside, aka he has no redemption arc. It's okay for villains not to be redeemable. In fact, most of them aren't. There is at least a sliver of a doubt with all of them. With King Magnifico, there was no doubt about him being totally maniacally corrupt all along. That is why, from a writing perspective, absolutely none of this made any sense. King Magnifico had so many different characteristics, traits borrowed from other archetypes, that in the end, he just didn't make a good character. I think that Disney placed such an immense focus on making him the most evil being that they had ever come up with that he began to eclipse or overpower the entire script of the movie. Magnifico's personality began dictating the entire film. Every twist and turn became about a new development in his character, or what he was now up to. In the beginning, the film took on a pretty vibrant route, which is typical when a storyline is about to unveil a twist. Once the evil part of his personality had been established, the film switched to being more oriented around finding a power that could defeat him. This is because he also had a supernatural element. When the thing that could defeat him, Star's powers, was found, he moved on to become even more vile. From that point onwards, the entire movie was about overcoming his vileness, and this was more than half of the movie. The blend of various different evil traits certainly amplified how purely and incomprehensibly evil Magnifico was, but we need to remember that this was a movie made for children. I think that unleashing such a horrific character, one who crushes the hopes and dreams of people, upon children, was a terrible idea. It's also that Disney's primary viewer base, these kids, wouldn't be able to understand the concepts of apathy and clinical disorders like depression. The film was trying to establish that our wishes, whether fulfilled or not, impart within us hope and optimism for the future. I don't think that children would be able to understand such a profound concept. In fact, considering the kind of reviews that Wish has gotten, I don't think a lot of adults grasp the idea either. Developing a fictional villain around these concepts and then tossing in so many cliches into the blend was certainly not the best way to go about things. Creating an evil gradient for King Magnifico and then continuously sliding it up the scale up until the very end of the film also became a little too much. It also weakened his core characteristic or trope, which was to make him egotistical and narcissistic.
Well, you do love mirrors.
Remember what I said about King Magnifico being an origin story in and of himself? He's actually the mirror from Snow White. We'll get into the fact that the dwarves couldn't have switched genders in the era of Snow White some other day. At the moment, let's take a look at how this weakens him. See, the mirror in Snow White is depicted to be the epitome of narcissism. As most canons have explained, the evil mirror is exactly that. Furthermore, he also encourages those who visit him to become egotistical. That wasn't clearly explained anywhere in Wish. And when did he even like mirrors? There's only one shot in the whole film where he's looking into a mirror. Sure, there are statues and paintings of him everywhere, but this part wasn't clearly sketched out. Long story short, the potpourri of all these traits makes evaluating his core very difficult. It makes it hard to pinpoint his motives, overarching goals, and desires. It also makes it impossible for us to relate to him on any level at all. Even the character design of King Magnifico is flawed on multiple levels. Not only does it provide an inaccurate depiction of who he is, it also clashes with his already conflicting personality. To begin with, take a look at his attire. King Magnifico wears a white suit with an ivory cape. The white is supposed to represent the twist villain. His cloak has intricate accents of gold embroidery. That indicates his royalty and superior social status. But the blues and the purples, they're supposed to represent wisdom and higher power. King Magnifico may be a magician, but there's nothing about him that is wise. If he didn't stay hidden from people 29 days of the month and have a loyal wife, chances are that he would have succumbed to the book's dark magic a long time ago and wouldn't have been able to build a kingdom. His wife was the one who stopped him from learning dark magic. The outfit, therefore, doesn't quite capture the essence of his being. The angular and sharp features on his face signify his controlling nature with underlying hints of menace. His bright blue eyes, however, give another message. They seem to be warmer and kinder even. Later on, when he becomes equipped with the staff, which Maleficent would use in Sleeping Beauty, his face warps into a vision of deranged evil. I understand that the writers are trying to convey that his underlying menace took over the rest of his being, but it's not convincing because he was already the villain at the start of the film. What did they think they were doing? To write an egotistical villain, you'd need to bind a convincing backstory with strong motivations and then play out the achievement of these desires into an elaborate scheme of villainy. That's not what happened with King Magnifico. He was definitely egotistical and narcissistic, no doubt about it. He clung to power and shut down anyone who challenged the status quo, so that made him a tyrannical villain. However, his defining feature was that he was a cocktail of various types of villains, and one that neither sits well nor tastes very good. The good news is that avoiding writing an egotistical villain like King Magnifico is pretty easy. Let me break it down for you. Step 1. Don't skimp on the backstory. The absence of a backstory that dove into how and why King Magnifico started abusing people's wishes made him impossible to understand, sure, but it also made him a shallowly written character. It didn't add depth to his personality. This could have been avoided by explaining how he may have discovered the power of keeping these wishes and then made a conscious choice to do so. Having a character make a choice to be evil is a lot more impactful in terms of demonstrating who they are. Step 2. Don't trade their sidekick. A lot of switches happened in this film. One of them was the fact that King Magnifico's original sidekick, the Queen, with Simon. It's also worth noting that the Queen wasn't even really a sidekick, just a loyal partner, as the movie described her. She was essentially a side character, so was Simon. To place both of these people in this position was confusing. This is because they weren't assets. They both had their unique places within the movie. The Queen in informing the rebellion, and Simon in demonstrating the fact that Magnifico's wish-granting regime was evil. It just weakened everything. Step 3. Don't mess up their motivation. As I've mentioned before, it wasn't clear whether King Magnifico wanted to maintain the status quo or to become more powerful. This is because of the lack of clear ties between his motives and backstory. If we had found out, for example, that King Magnifico had been the one to get rid of Asha's father, who introduced the concept of wishing upon stars, we'd understand how his current derangement was linked to his past. Step 4. Don't make them get steadily worse. Showing a villain as good at the beginning and then making them the bad guy might have been okay, but then making them become even more evil without clearly establishing the how and why made for a poor overall equation. Step 5. Don't incorporate more than 3 tropes. King Magnifico could have been an egotistical magician. We would have bought that. He could also have been a tyrant. We would have bought that too. But for one person to be so many things, a tyrant, a magician, a narcissist, a bad guy who seems to be good, it just all got to be too much. He could have unleashed his unbridled menacing wrath upon Asha when she found out the truth about him, but instead he waited. He wanted to keep up that good guy persona. This made him unpredictable, which was terrifying, but there needed to be less of a blend of so many different characteristics. I guess that's what Disney wanted. An egomaniacal magician villain cannot just suddenly lose his cool because of one incident. He can't feel threatened by a teenager who is auditioning to be his apprentice. There needs to be more consistency in the bad guys that we write. Disney tried their absolute best to create a villain that would terrify people. Despite what most reviews have to say, I think they succeeded somewhat. It's just that King Magnifico was terribly written. He wasn't a consistent or well-rounded character. We can't relate to him. We can't understand what he wants. I mean, we get it, but only at face value. There's no depth to any of it, and King Magnifico wasn't written to be understood by everyone. He was written to be understood by a very niche group of people. Those of us who have had our hopes and wishes squashed, and those of us who have walked around life without a purpose understood. We could feel the power of those wishes as well as the absence of them, so we got what he was trying to do, not everyone else. And that was why King Magnifico was just plain bad writing. What do you think? Did you think that King Magnifico could have been written differently, or did Disney's version make sense to you? Also, do you think he might have killed Asha's father, and the makers just left that part out? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and share this video. Until next time.